Starter. First of all, thank you all for joining and registering. We know that it's an extra layer to convert you to join us today, but we appreciate it. I'm Kimberly Alula, head of our inclusion and innovation group here at Fanatics for the IDEA team. Laura is here for my team as well. You want to say hi, Laura?
Hello, good evening, good afternoon, good morning.
We are so excited to have you all here. Today, we have the pleasure of having the engineering inclusion team. I must say that this was a brainchild of mine from a few months ago when I saw Dr. Megan Pollock do an amazing TEDx that really struck me. And I thought that she was exactly what we were looking for. I'm sure she'll get into her background and introduce her team as well, but I'm just really thrilled to have the opportunity to have this two-part session that really can help our tech org with inclusive leadership. Your organization is the first that we're trying something new. As you know, we have Fanatics University, where you can continue to go on and look at amazing self-guided courses and even take some of the webinars that we watch, some of the webinars that we've already done as it relates to inclusion, diversity, equality, and advocacy of Fanatics. But we wanted to see what the impact could be like if we worked directly with teams and leaders who work with each other every day, not just joining a webinar with anybody from the company. So as we go through these sessions, definitely send feedback. Let us know how it's going, what you're learning. We're very curious to hear how you're feeling about it. A huge thank you to Ramana, John Bailey, Leela, for really getting us where we are today. It was just my idea, but it's about the execution. And that was all really Leela and Laura working with the engineering inclusion team. So thank you all. And I really appreciate it. So let's go ahead. Don't forget, in the chat, there's a handout for today's session. I am not a great speaker, so I'm going to hand it off to Dr. Pollock and her team to lead us in today's session. I'm excited to learn alongside you. Thank you for joining.
Kimberly, before Megan jumps in, can I say a few words? Megan, first of all, thank you for joining. By the way, on the call, we have both engineering leaders as well as product management leaders and operational leaders. So it's a pretty diverse skill set. I know we call this engineering inclusion, but yeah, it's a very diverse set of leaders that we have. And one last thing, and I start emphasizing to my leadership team, in addition to technology and data changing, the innovation, I actually see a world where culture will be a blocker, even if you have great technologies and great data ecosystem. So we are super excited to have you and take us through some of your experiences and ideas.
Thanks so much. Yeah, so the term engineer, we're using it here as a verb. So you don't have to be an engineer to be here, but we all are going to learn how we can intentionally engineer inclusion into our environments. So thank you so much for that introduction. My name is Megan Pollock, and I'm based out of Dallas, Texas. And so thank you for that introduction. My background is I'm an engineer. I used to work for Texas Instruments. And so I worked as a product engineer, working on really cool technologies, a digital micro mirror device. I keep one here to remind myself of those fun days playing with tiny mirrors. But about 12 years ago, I switched from widgets to workshops and went back to grad school, really with the mission to change the culture of engineering. I wanted to create more opportunities for women and people of color to not only enter into, to be successful in those spaces and to feel like they are valued and that they belong. Today, I want to introduce you to a couple of my colleagues that I have. They're going to be supporting us. I have here with me Dr. Kayla Maxey, and we have a shared connection. Kayla and Fantasy and I do with Purdue University. But Kayla, she is really she has also worked in industry, and her current work supports engineering leaders in advancing cultures of inclusion to create infrastructures that make the most of differences. And so she has 10 years experience as a technical project manager and consultant for new medical devices in the healthcare industry. And my colleague Fantasy, she is working on her doctorate at Arizona State. And she has a background in manufacturing engineering. And so she works as a critical researcher and mentor to engineer access and more inclusion for more fulfilling opportunities for people of color and women. And so I want to also introduce you to Casey Haig. She is our Zoom champion today. So she's going to be filling up the chat with lots of great resources for you. So you can always download the chat at the end of this, but I will also send everything to you. So you can capture it as you're taking notes, but I'll send you everything that we're sharing. And so Casey is based out of New Orleans, and she runs Two Friends Improv Theater. And she's been teaching improv since 2014 and performing since 2010. And so I'm grateful to have her. So if you have any questions, you can ask Casey for help today. So our agenda, roughly, we've got 90 minutes together. We're going to go through an introduction. You're going to learn the inclusive engineering development model, and you're going to get time to apply it today. Our guiding questions and objectives. First, we're going to talk about what is an inclusive leader. And so you're going to reflect on what that means to you. And we're going to talk about how to become one. And so you're going to explore the iterative process. You're going to be able to assess and make a plan to adapt your leadership practices to become more inclusive leaders. And you're going to leave with tons of strategies and resources. If you haven't already downloaded the packet, you're going to want to pull it up on another screen, another desktop that you can kind of swipe over. There's nothing particularly crucial in it if you can't get easy access to it today, but we do want you to access that. Another key thing that we aim to do today is we want to model some practices for you. So just as we are trying to encourage you to develop inclusive leadership practices, we're going to try to model some of the ways in which you can engineer inclusion into your meetings. And so we'll sort of tell you when we're in sort of coach teacher mode, and then as we move back and forth. Now, also in your packet are some tools that we're going to use. Now, every group that you ever work with naturally develops some normative behaviors, expectations, and some unwritten ways of operating. But for us, we believe that to intentionally engineer inclusion, you can set or establish some norms that scaffold equitable and inclusive practices. So we recommend starting meetings with this, checking in with this every so often. And so these are our, what I call our session pledge. You can call them group norms, ground rules, shared agreements, whatever. And so I want to encourage you to stay engaged today. I get that your jobs haven't stopped, but try to do whatever you can to help yourself be engaged in our activity. Remember to share the mic. We're going to provide some different ways of working in our breakout rooms to help you share the mic, but we want to make sure that we're elevating voices that may not normally get a chance to speak. We want to be really supportive in this space, right? We're all learning, we are all on this journey, and we're all growing. And so we want to call each other in. We don't want to call people out in this work. And then finally, be ready to stretch and reflect, because we want to help all of us develop into the best leaders that we can be. All right, so now getting ready for our first breakout, we're going to place you into some small random groups of about 3. And you're going to do just a quick round of introductions. So name, role, and then what do you hope to get out of today's session? And so I'm going to have a Slido up and I'm going to broadcast it to the breakout rooms. And so I want you to have a really quick 4-minute round robin discussion with the group, and then share that on the Slido, and then we'll come back. So again, just think about what do you hope to get out of today's session? So Casey's getting the rooms queued up for us. I'm going to drop, she's got the instructions in the chat. All right, Casey, we're ready when you are.
All right, thanks everyone.
So I am sure that you had some enriching conversations. Thanks so much for your contributions to the poll here. If you didn't get a chance to contribute, I do want to encourage you to go ahead and get it open on your phone. I encourage you to use a smartphone because it is really easy and accessible in a way. So open up the QR code and then you'll use the same page of your browser throughout the whole workshop. It'll keep updating. So we're going to dive in, and we're using good learning theory and neuroscience of how the brain learns. And so I want to start with a prompt for you. I want you to think about, what is inclusive leadership? What are the traits, the qualities, and the behaviors of inclusive leadership? And so as we open up this next poll, really I'm just trying to get those neurons firing and get you thinking about what is it to you? And then we will build on that knowledge. So what is an inclusive leader? What are the traits, the qualities, and the behaviors of inclusive leadership? So again, if you already had the QR code open, it's the same page. It will refresh. All right, so setting up a safe environment, someone who's open, someone who is self-aware of their own biases, considering differences on the team, how that can be an advantage or disadvantage, someone who is practices humility, they're respectful and trustworthy, an active listener, someone who encourages diversity of thought, action, and behaviors, includes different perspectives, considering people as holistic beings, not just workaholics. Friendly, treat everyone equally, aware of cultural differences, being equitable to each team member, open, authentic, vulnerable, fair, recognition, making sure everyone feels their voices are heard, good, providing equal time, attention, focus, practice active listening. Lots of thoughts on listening here. That is absolutely important. Helping everyone contribute and feel like they belong. And great input here. Togetherness, listen, seek input. Acknowledging that we are different in many ways and embrace it. Someone who knows the full cycle of leadership, seeks to understand. Create a space to be psychologically safe. All right, great ideas. All right. So thank you for that. We're going to continue to build on your ideas. So inclusive leadership, it is a set of behaviors for any person, any leader. And when we say leader, we don't necessarily mean somebody who's a manager and who has lots of people reporting to them. Really, this is anyone, right? Any of us can be an inclusive leader. So these are behaviors that focus on facilitating group members feeling part of the group and retaining their sense of individuality while contributing to the group processes and outcomes. And so if we think about these three bullets, feeling part of the group, retaining sense of individuality, and contributing to the group, what do you think it feels like to belong while being your authentic self and being a valuable part of the team, right? For some of us who are from some of the dominant groups, meaning like most of the people on our team look a little bit like us, we feel like we belong, right? Because it's the normative behavior is something similar to our lived experience. And I want to share a quote from a colleague of mine who watched my TED Talk, and he spent, I think he said about like 30 years in oil and gas industry. And he said, I worked in a male-dominated engineering industry, oil and gas. We had female engineers all the way back to the 80s. We had female engineers. I never saw them treated differently, but I never thought about how they might feel in that environment. I never thought about how they might feel in that environment. And I was so grateful for his reflection because it was such an aha moment to me of recognizing how someone, he's a white male who is one of the nicest guys I've ever met in my whole life. And I bet he was an amazing teammate to work with. But for him to say, like, I never thought about how someone on my team might have felt, right? Did they feel like they belong? Did they feel valued? Did they feel included, right? And that's really what we want to get at today and thinking about, do people feel like they're a part of the group? Now, any number of us can work really hard to like figure out how to fit, right? And when we figure out how to fit, what happens? Fantasy, Kayla, what happens when we try to fit into an environment?
Burnout. Eventually we lead to burnout. We're working so hard as individuals to fit into a culture that the things that we can bring or give to a culture sit by the wayside, and then we become non-contributors in the way that we would have liked to be. And then usually that causes us to say, you know what, this might not be the place for me, and I start looking elsewhere.
Yeah, exactly.
You also become really numb. So, you become numb to a lot of different things. The way that you actually feel and process, like the work, the people that you work with, your interactions with others, even your workload. Like when I feel like I can truly authentically be myself, I am so much more creative and innovative, and I will get stuff done before time is due. But if I'm not, and I'm just trying to focus so hard on fitting into the culture, I'm always just kind of like producing like whatever is just asked of me just to get it out. Like, it's not like I don't consider it my best work. And that's an honest reflection.
Yeah, thanks, Kayla, and thanks, Fantasy. And the science behind this is that we have cognitive loads that when we're trying to fit into a space, whether we recognize it or not. And when we have a cognitive load that's focused on like, what am I supposed to do in this environment that is not normal to me? It reduces our capacity to engage. It reduces our cognitive function. And those are all the things that we typically evaluate people for, right? And so our job as leaders is to figure out how do we create spaces where people feel like they belong, not in space that they feel like they should try and fit in to belong, right? So what we're going to do next is we're going to give you another opportunity in breakout rooms to discuss. And I want to encourage you to use the round robin brainstorming technique. And so what round robin brainstorming is, if you aren't familiar with it, is so one person is going to go at a time with one idea at a time. And you're going to keep going until all ideas are exhausted. So I give an idea, Kayla gives an idea, Fantasy gives an idea, Casey gives an idea, and then we keep going until everything's burned out. And why this is something that we want to model for you is because this is a great way to make sure everyone gets a voice in the space. Certainly anybody can pass, but we want to give them space to have an idea. It doesn't mean rapid fire. It just means we're trying to create that space. So for this conversation that we have for you now, we want you to think about what does it feel like to belong while being your authentic self and to be a valuable part of the team. So what does it feel like to belong while being your authentic self? So those are two really key connections there. And what does it feel like to be a valuable part of the team? So Casey's going to put you into different groups. She's going to shuffle them up. Again, check the chat for the prompts. I'm going to share the screen with you. If you need a reminder of how the round robin works, you can click the image from your phone and it'll pop open that image. Okay. All right. We're ready when you are, Casey.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Welcome back, everyone. So let's do a brief collective debrief on these two questions. So what were some of the, if anybody wants to report out some sort of salient points, takeaway ideas from your conversations about what it feels like to belong? What did you discover as you have this conversation?
Well, I'll jump in. For me, it was just sort of that self-realization moment that me personally, I'm happier at work. I like my job a lot more when I'm at a place where people just sort of accept me and the quirks of my personality and appreciate them.
Yeah.
We love
so much
all your quirks, John.
I was going to say +1 on that.
What are John's quirks? Like, I don't see any.
Oh. You're getting lots of love today.
Well,
John.
I was using the fact that I swear more than I should for in a business environment and being an HR professional, but I'm sure there's plenty of others.
I got you beat, John.
And that was a great example for me. You're able to add some banter, and take the mick out of people if you want to. That really shows good trust and relationship, I think.
Thanks. John, I actually never cursed until I started working in industry. And I only started cursing just to like fit in with my team. And now I can't stop. So I get it. Sometimes we do things to fit in, and then sometimes it's a good adaptation, perhaps. What else? Something else. Maybe let's talk about what is it that you notice about the people on your team who you believe are their full authentic selves, and really thinking about how do you know? How do you know who feels like they belong? Caitlin?
So Yeah, so our group, Karen, Joel, myself, we were thinking maybe this was a trick question because you may not actually know unless you ask. People may put a face forward that may not actually be their authentic self. So always good to ask.
Yeah.
That was
It wasn't meant to be a trick question, but it is a complex, layered question for sure. Yeah.
Although Caitlin, I was thinking about that too, just a little different. A person can portray that, doesn't mean they feel that in return, though.
Yeah, thanks.
These
Janine.
are definitely good things that, and I know every organization is slightly different, but if you have onboarding processes that have like 30-day and 90-day and 1-year check-ins, that these can get built into to help support, especially new team members coming into the process.
Actually, I think that if you're listening and you're paying attention, you can pick that up pretty easily when someone's not contributing and not participating and not being engaged. But you've got to make the effort to do that, and you have to make the effort to kind of pay attention to everyone in the group. Whether it's one-on-one meetings every week or staff meetings, you can usually pick that up pretty quickly when someone's not being engaged.
Yeah.
Something we mentioned in our breakout session was that you can see a difference when somebody's talking about things related to work versus things that are not related to work. And maybe you'll see a light in that people's face or a different attitude, a different body language. So that's a way to see that, they're maybe not as authentic that they could be.
I can go with one. Sorry, Kiran, go ahead. I'll wait for it.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Echoing on all the things, being authentic myself, the day I walked into Fanatics office like 6 years before is the same myself right now with the same passion, same energy, and the same inclusivity in the team. So the day I walk into the office with the same high fives, same smiles on the face, and it has been the way so far. And that echoes what we are talking about, inclusivity.
And one of the things I feel, if we see people are being a little more comfortable being vulnerable, I feel because it's not easy generally to be vulnerable if you're not feeling that sense of belonging or like the team is really going to help me through this. I feel that could be one sign.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Sorry, Megan, real quick before we move on, just to be in the frame of inclusivity. I think Matt was trying to say something a couple times.
Go for it, Matt.
No, in general, I think everyone's kind of hit it. I really think it's kind of about how passionate they are, whether they're energized to show up to work, whether they're telling you something about what they did with their personal time off hours over the weekend, or just voicing their frustration and disagreements with the direction of a project. I think there are multiple ways to put a finger on whether someone's genuinely themselves or not, whether they're comfortable to express their emotions and their passion for whatever that topic might be in the work environment.
Excellent. Thank you. So excellent endpoint. And points. I want you to continue to think about, just because we see that someone might look like they fit in and they belong, doesn't mean that they do, to Janine's point earlier, right? And when I reflect on my own experience as an engineer, I didn't realize how inauthentic I had become as a person until I left, right? And it wasn't until I left that I realized how much I had changed to try and fit in and as a survival tactic in that space. And so from the outside, people would have thought, oh yeah, Megan fits in great here, right? Like she goes to all the football games, all the happy hours, and she curses like a sailor, like the rest of us. But there was a lot that I had to do to make that be part of that team, right? And so that's something that we're going to talk about, the sort of dominant norms and how we need to pay attention to those. And so why we're talking about this work is because the feelings of belonging and being valued, these are fundamental human needs. And so people need to perceive that they are a valued member of a team and experience treatment that satisfies their needs for belongingness and uniqueness in the workplace. And so inclusive leadership helps us to address these two things, and it enhances performance, collaboration, attendance, all those good things too. But when we look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, belongingness is right in the middle, right? It's right in the middle, which is before our efficacy, our esteem, can we do something, and our actualization, which is our motivation to move forward. And so this is a critical need that has to be met within the space. And it's not something of like, okay, I'm determined to fit in, so I'm going to fit in. That kind of belonging is different than a true sense of belonging. And so again, to get our employees and to get ourselves into a place of fulfillment, we have to have those psychological and physiological needs met. And so again, as I said, inclusive leadership, it facilitates belongingness, it helps people feel valued, it enhances performance, it improves collaboration, it boosts attendance, and it reduces turnover. And so with all of these great things, does Fanatics need inclusive leaders, and are you one? Hopefully, to some extent, right? And the answer is certainly yes. Everybody needs inclusive leaders, and all of us can become one, and we can become a better one through the process of continued practice. So we're going to talk about today the inclusive leadership development model, and it's a 4-part iterative process. You're never done. We're always learning, we're always growing, we're always continuing to develop. And so this model is going to be published in a book any day now. And so we can put a link in the chat, but the link is not live yet. But it is going to be open source whenever it is available. And so I'm excited to have this publication publicized, and it's going, the roots of the model comes from lots of engineering standards, but it's also just a good old model. And so what we want to help you do today is to think about where you fit with the things. And so if you open up your packet on page 6, we're going to go through the growth continuum, and there's going to be a reflection tool that we're going to have you stop and think about as we go through each of the steps. And so the first part of this growth continuum is that you recognize an opportunity to learn and to practice knowledge and skills, but you haven't decided to yet, right? So these are areas where you are increasing some awareness, but you're not making that choice. So novice is someone who is demonstrating beginning knowledge and skills, but you're sort of in a limited use state of the defined practice. Now committed, this is right in the middle. This means you're committed to the work, committed to the element, and you're making an effort to expand your knowledge and skills, but your performance is inconsistent. And so I can speak for myself as, you know, a white woman growing up with, and the way that I did in my own lived experience and privilege, that I feel like a lot of my life isn't committed, but it also really leans towards some of the other ends of the continuum as well. So proficient means that we are applying knowledge and skills, and we're consistent and consistently and thoroughly in a recognizable way. So like this means that other people notice that we're doing it, not just ourselves. An exemplar, the key here is that you are modeling this activity. And so this is something that's really important to me, is even though I'm on a journey of learning, I try to model these practices, and I try to be really transparent about them so that other people can learn and grow and develop with me as well. And then the final stage of the growth continuum is that you are stimulating and facilitating institutional change, improving system-wide outcomes. And so when we go throughout the workshop today, you're going to have a chance to reflect on where you sort of find yourself in each of these different levels, okay? And you might find, like I said, that you're both committed and a reformer. So you can be more than one thing, right? And so give yourself grace and self-awareness as you're moving through that. So we're going to talk about the first part of the process, and it starts with you. So an inclusive leader understands the social and political context that creates their identity and how it influences and biases our perception of and outlook on the world. And so what this means is that you have an active exercise of trying to understand your lived experiences and how it shapes how you move through the world, how it shapes how you perceive the world. The technical term here is called positionality. And in your packet, there are 2 pages of key terms. So if you want to, I've got all of those, the key terms noted there. And so positionality, it's that social and political context, and it describes how our identity, influences and biases our outlook on the world. And what I mean by identity are any dimensions of who we are: our race, our gender, our socioeconomic status, our ability status. And that could be both hidden and visible disabilities, right? Just because someone doesn't have a wheelchair doesn't mean that they don't experience and live with a disability, both physical or mental. We've certainly seen lots of issues over the last few years around within the workplace in the world around race. When we think about the George Floyd murder, when we think about the experiences of Asian people in the US and how they have been treated as a result of the coronavirus. We think about people's sexual orientation. That can be something that you know or you don't know. The faith that people have. Physical attributes, whether your body size affects how you move through the world and how people perceive you. People have trauma that they have lived with or maybe going through. Age is certainly always a factor in how you perceive the world, and your language skills. So I want you to take a second and just sort of think about your identity. And one of our, suggested homework exercises is to examine your positionality and to think about how it influences your view on the world. Kayla, Fantasy, anything you want to add to the importance of understanding your identity?
As many of us could imagine, and especially if there are parents or caregivers in the world, you probably, many of us go through our home life and we're like, we're not going to do the thing that our parents did. And in that, what we end up finding as we're rearing, the next generation or our children or people that we're responsible for, is we do a lot of the same things that our mother or father or caregiver had done. And so I think that's where Megan is pushing us to this identity. Part of that is because that is our lived experience. That is the way in which we grew up. And so that becomes our innate foundation. Doesn't mean it's right, doesn't mean it's wrong, but sometimes it has impacts that we don't intend. And so understanding that allows us to understand how we're making decisions, how we interact with people, when we feel maybe targeted or not targeted, and then we can move differently within the world of our inclusive leadership in that way.
And I just want to add, be patient with yourself while you're doing this, because these things are very complex. Like a lot of these things are fluid, right? Like I could be in one socioeconomic status at one point in my life and then shift to another one. So a lot of these things are dynamic. They're constantly moving. They're constantly changing. It also depends on the environment you're in, right? So like in your group, it may be different than it is when you're, like in another meeting, so it is a very complex task. However, it's doable. And I just say, give yourself some grace while you're working through it. And if you don't know all the answers, it's okay. We don't know all the answers. And that's the part, that's why Megan said we're lifelong learners. We're always going to be learning about ourselves. The more we learn about ourselves and how we move through the world is going to help us figure out how we're impacting the lives of others through our interactions with them and through the practices and privileges or not that we have. So.
Thanks, both of you. So in your packet, I have included some strategies. The strategies for this section are on page 10. And so we've already talked about examining your positionality. Second is to incorporate reflection activities into your day. So think about the ways in which asking yourself really explicit questions about how does my gender, my race, my ability, or any other intersection of my identity, how might it be advantaging me or disadvantaging me in a situation or collaboration? So when you begin to sort of intentionally question and interrogate the way in which pieces of our identity change how we move through the world or influence how we experience the world, it increases our visibility to the lived experiences of ourselves and of others. Another key opportunity here is to create a culture of feedback on your team that holds space for helping each other to learn, to see, and to examine blind spots, right? And so sometimes we don't know what we don't know, and we are surrounded by people who can trust us and to give us feedback to say, you know, I don't think this is what you meant. You might not be aware of another meaning of what you just said, or, you know, giving space to have that culture of feedback can really help us develop and shine a light on those blind spots. I want to give you a chance to reflect now. Now, again, we're skimming the surface here. I'm going to challenge you all to do some learning and some application when we leave before we come back next month. But I want you to take a minute and reflect. So there's a space for this on page 7 and the, let's see. So again, sort of try and rate yourself and then think about any evidence of practice that you can identify. And if you have time, think about some goals for growth. And this is a form, so you can write on it if you want. I'm gonna set like a 90-second timer or so. All right. Now you're going to have some more time to reflect, and we're going to put you in groups in the end of this overview to really reflect on this, but we're going to move forward. So the next part of the inclusive leadership development model is what I call the lens. So the first part is really learning to look in, and the lens is recognizing the way in which we look out. And so there are 2 key parts of this. The first is systemic thinking. And so here, an inclusive leader is someone who considers how systems of oppression and advantage influence their decisions and impact their team. And then the second part is the ethical dilemma of bias. So an inclusive leader here investigates how interpersonal and institutionalized biases produce an ethical dilemma that one must address. So I want to do a couple of key terms here since I've already been using the term marginalized. So first, marginalization, it is the treatment of a person, a group, or a concept as insignificant or peripheral. So like literally on the margin, right? So marginalized groups refer to individuals who are consistently confined to the lower or peripheral edges of society or groups because they are commonly seen as different from the perceived norms and dominant cultures. And so people from marginalized groups often experience disadvantage and discrimination that stem from systemic social inequalities and justice. And so, you know, for the example, within the field of technology and engineering, women and people of color, people who experience who have disabilities, people from non-normative, from non-heterosexual relationships, like these, everyone who are outside of those experience marginalization within technology and engineering because they've been traditionally excluded from those pathways. And so one way to think about it is, diversity is a given, right? Diversity, when we look around, we may not see the diversity that's truly there because there's so much under the surface if we think about diversity as an iceberg. But what inclusion does is it's, instead of saying, hey, we're trying to come fit in, come, sit at the table with us, you can fit in with us. Inclusion is saying, hey, we're going to expand the way that we operate. We're going to expand the margins so that more people fit within the space. So again, it's different than just saying, hey, we're going to add you, diverse person, to come fit into our group. But inclusion is, how are we changing our behaviors? Now, I want to introduce you to a way of thinking about oppression and through the 4I framework. So, and I'm just going to touch on this, and Casey's going to put a link in the chat if you want to learn more about this. And in your packet on page 14, there's more detail about this. But this graphic shows how systems of oppression work together, how they interact and how they overlap. And so oppression, it's the combination of prejudice and power that creates a system that discriminates against some groups and benefits other groups. So examples of these systems are racism, sexism, heterosexism, ableism, all the isms, classism, ageism, anti-Semitism. So these systems, they were and are designed by people and upheld by people. So we may not even know that we're upholding them, but we can sometimes be complicit in that, particularly for those of us who benefit from those systems. And there are 4 types. So ideological, interpersonal, institutionalized, and internalized. And so through this lens of barriers, we can begin to parse out, and think about some of the ways in which people experience barriers within the workplace. But it's important to note that when we begin to address these, like, we have to address all 4 levels to create meaningful and sustained change. So often when it comes to sort of, I'm going to use air quotes here, diversity trainings, it's limited between the sort of microaggressions between me and fantasy, right? Those are interpersonal exchanges. Now, those are things that we want to help, mitigate and reduce, but that's not going to address the systemic issues that people are facing in the workforce. We have to address them at all 4 levels. And so ideological, it's that foundation. It's the foundation of the 4 I's. And it's the idea that one group is superior to another. And it creates a sort of us versus them culture. Interpersonal interactions are how these ideologies are played out in our daily interactions. So either intentionally or unintentionally. So this includes implicit bias, micro messages, perpetuating or not interrupting stereotypes, or not recognizing power and privilege. Institutional impression, this creates a system of invisible barriers that limit people based on their membership in certain social identity groups. So, and these barriers, they are only invisible to those seemingly unaffected by it. So it kind of goes to what my friend Tommy said. I didn't see any barriers. It didn't affect me, right? But I never thought about how my colleagues might feel. I never thought about the invisible barriers, the barriers that are invisible to me that my colleagues might be facing, right? And so again, these institutionalized things are what happen when ideologies are embedded within our organizations by people. And so fourth and finally, internalized impression. And so I want to make sure you hear me say that oppression always comes from the outside. But by the time it gets to like an internalized belief, the external oppression really doesn't even need to hardly be felt because the damage has already been done. And so examples of internalized oppression are like feelings of self-hate, believing negative messaging, powerlessness, and despair. And so this internalized oppression begins to say well, I can't speak up against the sexual harassment that I just faced because of what's going to happen to me if I do, right? Or the sort of fear that comes as a result of some of those things. It becomes internalized. So Kayla and Fantasy, anything you want to add to thinking about the lens of bias and systemic thinking?
I think one thing that that came to mind as you were talking about, especially from the ideological lens, is we all like everyone in the work environment made huge adjustments, right? When COVID hit and we went into quarantine and we went into remote work, and the ways in which we foundationally believed we had to work prior to 2020 shifted. And those are the ideological shifts they ended up happening in all 4 of these I's, right? So this idea of being acceptable to be remote and still get work done was a fundamental work shift in the ideology. So as you're thinking about those, you can frame things in your current work structure. You can think about them from a before and after, because we ended up in a space where we had no choice but to start shifting some of these I's, possibly unknowingly, but they are good examples of how you are capable of shifting those I's and what the outputs or outcomes could have been for your project teams.
I was honestly going to mention the same thing about COVID. So +1 to Kayla, and I will pass it back to Megan.
All right, thanks. So again, a couple of strategies, and we're going to give you a minute to reflect. So the first thing here is to, learn the 4 I's of oppression, and, really begin to focus on ways that we don't want to allow reduction of broad conversations of bias to just the interpersonal, because this is a tendency of people, and it's a human tendency, but we want to really push ourselves and others to think about issues systemically. We want to make sure that we are always expanding our own knowledge and awareness, and intentionally decentering dominant cultures and And we can only do that by learning to recognize what are the dominant cultures, what are other ways of knowing and doing. We want to use root cause analysis as a tool to understand issues. Root cause analysis, this is something that if you've been trained as an engineer or program manager, like if you know Six Sigma, like we could use that process. It's the same process that I use to help educational institutions address inequities within their programs, right? So we can use those same systems to address the challenges that we're facing. And then also like make sure that this notion of like the ethical dilemma of bias, it's part of all ethics conversations. Bias and how it, acts out in the workplace between employees, between your systems that you create, between the systems that you present to your customers. There is an ethical dilemma of bias for which we have to take action. So I want you to turn now again back to page 7 and reflect a little bit on your experience and where you fit on this growth continuum. Think about what evidence you have of your practice and think about some goals that you can set to move forward. All right, let's come back together. So now we're going to move forward to the next part of the process, and these are the practices. So, the first 2 stages of individual and our lens, this is really about increasing our awareness, but awareness isn't enough. We got to do something, right? If we just have an awareness of things that we could do, but we don't make any choice to do anything, then what's the point? So the first piece of the practices that we're going to talk about is a human-centered approach. Now, a human-centered approach means that as an inclusive leader, you are working from an asset or a strengths-based mindset, and that you're recognizing and celebrating the beauty and the value of diversity. Inclusive leaders intentionally lead with empathy, curiosity, and open-mindedness, with the intention to strengthen the dignity of all of the humans around us. And then the next key part of this is that an inclusive leader is an accountable lifelong learner. And so what that means is that you are reflecting on your personal and institutional actions, and that you're committed to learning more about what you don't know, including other ways of knowing and doing. And that you are personally accountable for mistakes and failures and mishaps. And what that doesn't mean is that you are deflecting, avoiding responsibility, or claiming good intent. Because when we claim good intent and say, oh, well, you know what I meant, or, the common thing that we hear a lot is like, oh, I have a Black friend, I can't be racist, right? Like that is deflecting when someone's offering you feedback, right? Hear what they're saying and say, I thank you for that feedback. I'm going to take that and reflect on that. If we make a mistake, address it, right? Because we're trying to model how to be inclusive leaders, how to be inclusive collaborators. We have to own up to our mistakes and say, you know what, I can't believe I just said that. Like, I think I need to change my language there. Or, sometimes we can say idioms that we've said over and over again, and we need to be like, oh, you know what, I think I need to stop saying that, but let me look into that. So like owning up to that, having a responsibility when we make mistakes is really, really important. And to that first paragraph there, we have to keep learning, right? And it is not the responsibility of Fantasy and Kayla to tell me all the lived experiences of Black women, right? So that doesn't mean to go ask the one person of color that or the one person who has a disability or whatever, ask them to share everything about those lived experiences. Like there are lots of books, you can follow Twitter feeds, you can do all kinds of things, watch movies, like we need to go and learn. We need to learn about other ways of knowing and doing. We need to learn about the lived experiences of other people. And that helps us have a greater social consciousness, a greater awareness to the lived experiences of other people. So let's dive in and talk about what an asset mindset is. So an asset perspective is so important because it's really how we perceive an action or we perceive a quality of someone. And so if someone, and this is, to be quite honest, this is one of the hardest things I find to teach. And I'm just continuing to figure out unique and creative ways to teach this for like a full-on workshop kind of thing. But I really relate it to thinking about sort of like a glass half full kind of thing. Is like when you take an action of someone, are you seeing it as like they're lacking something or that they have something else valuable to add? If you have an employee who consistently does something that is different than how you would have done it, rather than saying, stop doing it that way, stop and think, well, maybe that way is a better way. what is the asset that this person brings to the workplace? How can I re-envision and consider the value that this person is bringing to this space rather than as lacking something? How do I see that as a strength? Kayla or Fantasy, you want to add anything on to asset perspective or strength?
I was just going to second your, like, this is by far one of the hardest, even, sitting in this work and doing this work and even sitting with identities that are often marginalized. This is one of the hardest things to be reflective and intentional about, because our innate human nature is to preserve, right? We have this flight or fight sense, and therefore we're always looking for what's harm. And our we're just naturally built that way, to look for what's harm. And so really looking for the good is a practice. And for me, this practice shows up after I get out of meetings with colleagues or meetings with teams that I'm consulting on. I literally sit down and I ask myself a set of questions. How did I show up in the space? How did the space make me feel? How do I think I made others feel? Did I celebrate the assets that were in the room? And this has been a very intentional practice for me, because I am a glass half full kind of person. So I think you have to understand where your orientation is, and then know that this is kind of completely counterintuitive to what we want to naturally do.
I want to add, I am not a half full type person. I usually am like, oh my God, this cup is almost empty. I need to get more water. However, so this process is something that I actually go through a lot with myself. And what I do is I actually sit and think of like what I said, and if it came off in a negative context. So like if it seems like whatever I said could be taken negatively, then I go back and I try to reframe it to make it seem more positive. Or if I feel like, even if it's something that I mean, right? Like I can mean something, but I don't have to always say it in like a harsh or like super direct way where somebody may shut down and get defensive about it before I even have the opportunity to talk to them about it. And then that also, like Kayla was saying, like, how did I show up in the space as well? So like, are you downplaying your own abilities and assets as well? So you need to make sure that you're uplifting yourself as well as trying to uplift and see like the positive in others. So when you do hear like negative perspectives, or someone who has a negative mindset was like, well, you didn't turn this in like at 12 like I wanted you to. I would say, well, I turned it in at 12:15 and it has 3 additional pages that actually are going to provide you with like more information that you needed to get this project done. And so, just always coming and trying to consider what are the positive things that are being presented that you're actually working with, showing what you're working with.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and so again, Fantasy, I'm with you. I think the beginning of COVID, I realized I've always fashioned myself an optimist, but I think beginning of COVID, I realized like, I think I lean a little bit more on the pessimist side. But hey, self-awareness is key. And recognizing the way in which we have a tendency to perceive things, and having that intentional practice of like, how can I view this action, view this thing differently, because it will definitely change your relationships with the people that you work with. So a couple of strategies here is to incorporate activities that encourage curiosity and respect of either ways of knowing and doing. So that really stands in the face of it. But this is how we've always done this, right? Like, and thinking about activities that really invite creative and different ways of doing. Emphasize empathy and accountability as a crucial skill for your team culture. So I'm going to give you a couple of seconds to reflect on this. We always have more content than we have time. So take 90 seconds and reflect on this section. All right, now we're going to push forward to the last piece, and then we're going to give you some time to work in breakout rooms to reflect on some of the things that you've been thinking about so far. And so this last piece are the outcomes. And again, like the others, there's 2 key components. So the first is culturally intelligent communication. And this one is, again, it takes an active practice. And many of you mentioned On the Slido, the importance of listening, right? And listening is a really, really key part to these outcomes. If we want to have the equitable outcomes that we desire, we have to be listening to not only people's words, to their actions, to their body language. And many of you were mentioning that in the beginning conversations. So an inclusive leader is attentive to which voices, values, and ways of knowing and doing are present, which are missing, and which are silenced. And they actively and empathically listen and search for cues to bridge those gaps amongst diverse people. And then inclusive collaboration, an inclusive leader actively and equitably engages diverse perspectives, experiences, and backgrounds to enrich the collectively shared environment, and balances the assumed norms to allow for more authentic engagement. Now, I hate to keep going back to like, the football example. So I mentioned that in my talk, but I am born and raised Texan. I've been every Friday night of my entire childhood. There was a football game. We were there. Like, we lived and breathed Texas Friday Night Lights. And then I realized as I went into industry, like, I was with a bunch of people I went to college with at Texas Tech, and we talked about football all the time. Now, what's interesting is what the challenge that you have as a leader is to think about, is my team talking about football too much, right? Is it dominating the airspace? Maybe it's not football. Maybe it's something else, right? Maybe it's Game of Thrones. I don't care, right? Maybe it's Star Wars, whatever it is that drives people's conversations. Is something taking up too much air? Is something dominating the norm so that those people who don't fit that activity are having to feel like they have to sort of try and fit into that? Or if they don't, are they literally pulling away? And so that's really what we want to think about, is what's the culture and the climate of our team like, and who is it serving? So using global listening, we can keep a pulse on the tone of conversations. We can keep a tone on the body language of the people that are around us. And we want to make sure that one way of knowing and doing, one sort of dominant norm, isn't the thing that is most often present in our space. And so again, you can look in your packet for some key definitions around culture and climate, but it's how people experience a space. Some specific strategies here are, what we evaluate is what we value. And so if you as an organization, if you as a leader want to determine that these things are important, how are you going to evaluate them? How are you ensuring that culturally intelligent communication and inclusive collaboration are metrics for success for your team members? Are you regularly prompting whose voices are missing or silenced? Why and what can and will we do? Like, this again is a practice. You have to ask those questions. I also always encourage people to host listening sessions, and don't forget to listen, right? Because how often do we have listening sessions and people share their insights and then nothing happens, right? So if you're going to have a listening session, don't forget to listen. Anything you want to add, Kayla and Fantasy, before we dive into this last reflection and then we give them some space to brainstorm?
I was just going to add one more strategy. Exit tickets, meeting exit tickets are another way to kind of hold this, of just letting people write down how either, can you not hear me?
I was asked, could you say it again? Okay. I couldn't hear what you said.
I was going to say meeting exit tickets. So writing, having an ending meeting question that prompts around the culturally intelligent communication or the inclusive collaboration. They're completely anonymous. You can take scrap pieces of paper, people jot down one word, and then whoever is, the meeting organizer or the team leads at that point can consolidate that information and kind of keep a pulse that way too. Because not everyone likes to say things vocally, or they may not feel comfortable saying them vocally, depending on what the culture and climate is.
And I just want to add that these strategies are important because, for one, like, I used to work in industry as a manufacturing engineer for Ford Motor Company. Although I loved working with my team, a lot of the conversation was driven. I was the only Black woman there. I was like the one of 6 women and probably one of 3 Black people that were in that particular space. I'm sure there were like other diverse measures, but as far as like what I could visibly see, that was like the diversity. And so one of the things that was always talked about was like sports, people playing basketball, going golfing, I don't do none of this stuff. Okay. So it was always like, even though my team never made me feel like I was directly excluded, I felt like I couldn't contribute to the conversation. So I would always like kind of stay like off to the side, or if they were always having conversations about that. Or the other thing was, parenting or relationships. Like, I'm not looking for no relationship right now, and I don't have any children. So if that's all we're talking about, I'm not going to be able to relate. So again, I was always on the outside, and I would have to, like either just kind of be at my desk. And then eventually it started looking like I was pulling away, or I wasn't intentionally pulling away, but it seemed like I was intentionally trying to like distance myself. Like I wasn't engaged, but it wasn't that. It was, I felt like I couldn't be included because I couldn't contribute to the conversation. And like, when we having conversations about stuff that we like, when people who don't understand it try to contribute, we don't always accept that type of feedback. So I didn't want to say the wrong thing, because I don't have kids and stuff. So I just, excluded myself. So I just wanted to say why it was important to talk about these things.
Yeah. And it's about balance. How do we balance that space so that everyone feels this sense of belonging? All right. So you know the drill. Take a little bit to reflect on this, and we're going to get you set up to go into breakout rooms to talk about the things that you've learned. So do a quick reflection on this, and then we'll bring you back together here in a second.
Were we supposed to have gone to a breakout?
No, not yet. You're reflecting. We're getting the breakout rooms ready for you. Thank you for that question. All right, Casey, if you'll get the breakout rooms ready, let's do 5 minutes in pairs. So we're putting you in pairs. We're doing a constructivist listening. So basically just like let one person talk, no responses, and then flip it, right? So we want to give people space to share what they're learning. And so the prompts for your conversation are: which areas would you like to increase your knowledge and skill? What are some of your goals, and what strategies do you want to apply? All right, so Casey, if you'll open the rooms.
Welcome back.
Welcome back. I know we've robbed you of some rich conversation, and I hope that you will take a note of who you were talking to so that you can continue the conversation after our time together. I want to point out a couple of things to you before we shift gears here. So in your packet, there are some other tools for you to look at and to use. And so if you'll look, first of all, there are tons of resources if you want to learn more. So there are QR codes that if you want to dig deeper into other resources, webinars, things that you can increase your learning. I am constantly creating new content, so you can join my mailing lists and be up to speed when new things come along. There's another tool here on cognitive biases. This is a great tool to have a conversation with your team. So it creates a shared language. This is particularly important when you're making any kind of people decisions, that you talk about these things, and you can use it as an anchor and say, hey, I think we might be having like, a horns and halo effect. I think we might be, bandwagon effect here. So this is a useful tool for you to employ. Another tool here is an unbiasing method. So this is sort of for our alliteration to help you create more inclusive environments as well. These are they're agreements of how you want to operate as a team if you agree that you want to reduce the ways in which bias shows up. So have a look at that and maybe put it into practice. And then the group norms were on the previous page, way back up at the top. So you can try that in a meeting and see how that changes an experience for you all. Before you shift gears completely, I want to make sure that you take some time to reflect. It's probably been a long time for some of you, many of you, some of you since you've been in school, but reflecting is really important for learning. And so take time to reflect before you completely shift gears to something else. And so make a plan for how you want to move forward. You didn't have a lot of time to reflect in that last piece, but we want to make sure that you take some time to do that. I want to encourage you to evaluate the session, especially because I'm going to get to work with you all again next month. And I'm working with the Women in Technology tomorrow. And so evaluate the session. I sincerely value your feedback. And so, Let me know what you think. How can we improve your experience? And so I also want to know what it is that would be beneficial for us to talk about next time. Because when we come back next time, we want to know what you tried and how did it work and what feels different. And so with that, again, I can stay on and talk a little longer, but I do want to just honor the time that you've planned for this for us today. I want to thank you for your commitment to equity and inclusion. I want to also congratulate y'all on the big news on the 27 billion last year. Like, that is like amazing. That's really awesome news. And that means that the world's watching you and you have a great opportunity to be an industry leader in creating equitable and inclusive spaces for everyone. And so I'm happy to hang on with any questions. I'd love to hear any reflections that you had for those of you who want to stick around, but I do want to acknowledge that some people have to drop off. So for those who do want to hang out, I'd love to hear some of the action plans that you set forth.
And thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was amazing. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much. Really appreciate the time.
Thanks, y'all.
Thanks, guys.
Appreciate it.
Oh, there may not be anyone left by the.
I still want to hear it. I still want to hear your thoughts.
I'm sticking around. I don't really have a great action plan to share, but I really did enjoy the session and the tools that you all provided. It was a really fantastic session, and it really got me thinking. I generally consider myself as a pretty aware person, but like, you know, I'm trying to think about how I can be more proactive and really have more of a bias toward action, as it's called. I don't have a great action plan as yet. I'm kind of the sort of person who's really introspective and needs time with these things. But you know, I'd appreciate any other advice that you all have to offer in your experiences.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. And I agree. 90 minutes, make an action plan. That's hard to do, but hopefully you've got some tools to help you. And like I said, I'll follow up with and share all the other resources that we did share today. So thanks for that. Thanks, Tim.
I think honoring your process, so knowing that you're introspective and just honoring that and being able to like take time, let it process and marinate. Like, we're all on this journey and it's very different for each of us, and the way in which it comes out is very different. So knowing that it doesn't have to be all or nothing, it is a continuum. So honoring that.
And I also like the term, someone gifted me with this once, is to give yourself grace. So one of the key things that happens when you increase your social consciousness is you have all of these oh shit moments of like, oh my God, I can't believe I did that. I can't believe I said that. And like, I got to go back and like redo history. Well, and you can't, right? And so give yourself grace to say like, okay, step one is acknowledging the problem. Step two is to acknowledge it and catch it in real time, right? And so we have to give ourselves grace, because if you just get upset at yourself, like we never make progress, you know?
Thank you. My thoughts are like, I felt this gave me a little more of a framework and be a little deliberate and be proactive about it, a little bit like echoing what Tim said. We all kind of, the values we are raised with, or we pick up through professional interactions, our own opinions. And I think we can connect to a lot of the pieces all of you talked about today, but it was very hard to know without. Now I feel like there is a framework to think through, and there is a little more deliberate about it. It was overwhelming, to be honest, like to know all of it, but I think it just gives us a framework to think, and then also like be a little more deliberate. I felt like because I felt in this mad rush of achieving things and building the company, sometimes I feel we are lost in really thinking about it a certain way. So thank you for that, and hopefully we'll continue to reflect and make use of it.
No, thanks.
Yeah, I reiterating, you've really done a great job of quantifying inclusion, right? And and probably from a practical aspect, which I haven't seen, and that was one of the things that I had asked, and I'll tell you the full context is when we're looking at our diversity and inclusion efforts across the organization. Really, when you're talking about diversifying the organization, the main means we have to do that is recruiting, right? Like that's, and that falls so heavily on the recruiting team and the hiring managers. And when I look at numbers for last year, we had, not unusual turnover with our Black employees, actually lower than industry average, but at the end of the year, we had the same number of Black employees as we did at the beginning of the year. And that was because every hire that was made was, in essence, backfilling someone who left. So, no progress from that perspective. And that was the moment where I realized, like, okay, this is the importance of inclusion, right? Because if we get better at that, that's going to help us with our retention. And then in turn, help us with our goals in diversifying the organization. So my ask was like, we really need to understand what inclusion means, and more importantly, like how do we manage from an inclusive perspective? So like this is the as far as I'm concerned, the biggest step. You've quantified this, right? So huge. And then the one ask I have, so this is very specific to me, but I'm a very visual learner. So I was constantly referring back to the PDF as you were going through the slides as well. And so a lot of stuff for me, I would like to see more practical examples of what we can do, and I look, so for me, as I was going through and rating, the lowest rating I gave myself was on systemic thinking, right, under lens, where the best I could do is check aware, right, because I'm not doing that at all. And I can understand conceptually, like, hey, really the guidance here is to think about these things, to consider these factors, but my question would be, in what way? And how so practically, and granted, I'm not an engineer, so the team I manage are not engineers, and I know this was definitely geared a little bit more towards the engineering, but when you look at the 10 people in my organization, we're Leela, help me out here. We're predominantly Caucasian, but not exclusively Asian, Hispanic, predominantly female. All of the females are more in the leadership positions, and our 3 males are in more in support positions. So we're atypical because the the females dominate the leadership in this group. But from that perspective, like how do I think about these things? What and in what's an example of when I should consider that, right? And that would be, and I'm not necessarily asking for a response on that specific example, but I'm just saying that would be helpful if we had the sort of the more practical examples baked in to some of the written materials as well.
I think that's a great idea, John, for us to bring in for the next session. So that since this session, we introduced the big picture, next time we can take some really, dig a little deeper and to get some of those practical examples. So that's a great idea.
And I forgot to include the caveat. And if that's something we cover in the next session, then ignore what I've said. But Fantasy, you did a really, really good job of saying, hey, here's an example of where these situations directly impacted me, right? And giving the context, like you were one of, I think you said 3 Black women, or maybe it was 3 Black people, and that is helpful. And that's the exact type of example that I like to hear, is like, from that perspective. And maybe we could, also an example of someone of Asian descent, and we, by the way, in our technology organization, I think we're, I think Asian might be the majority when we look at us globally. In fact, I think it is, but pretty equal. So we're very, very diverse in general. We hurt more in gender diversity. That's where we struggle, where the entire technology industry struggles. But that's what I want to see, is like, how do I now take this and apply this? And that's a little bit of a limitation on me. I've always had a hard time sometimes taking the philosophical and then translating it to the
That's not a
practical.
limitation.
So
It means you have a human brain.
well, yeah, sometimes I'm like, I need it to be spelled out for me. That's in essence. And when we do that, then that's something that we can then take to the organization, because I think a lot of these learnings aren't just for the managers. This is for the entire organization, because I think if you do feel like you don't feel as included, you can if you understand the process and what everyone is struggling with, I think it makes it easier for people to be more open about their own personal struggles.
Absolutely. I think those are great points, John. And I had two things that came to mind while you were talking. As a technical manager in quite a few different organizations over the years, exit interviews are crucial. And you hate to have people leave, but that data doesn't always get sent back to the organizations in which people are leaving from. So connecting with your HR folks that are doing those interviews may start to give you some insights into what that systemic thinking box is looking at. You know, why are individuals saying that they're taking on other opportunities? Often people who are disgruntled are happy to give negative feedback. And they're pretty honest. So that definitely is one place that I would maybe just thinking of, yes, we can definitely build in more examples for the next time, but maybe the first place that might be a button. The other thing that I want to caution us is when we talk about dominant and non-dominant in the US, that often gets prefaced between racial dynamics of white and Black, right? But as you said, your particular culture might be a gender dominance that is different than the norm, and that's totally okay. I think as you guys are working through each individual subculture, what dominant norm is operating in that subculture may be different. And that doesn't take away from being able to use that framework and apply it to that scenario, just because it's not what we see in like the normal US landscape is okay.
As someone who has left a couple places, I will tell you my exit interviews were very like detailed. And not just like from a harsh perspective, but just honestly sharing my experience, because at that point I felt like there was no retaliation, right? Like I was leaving. I didn't care what they said after I left. But I think a lot of times there's like this, I don't know, maybe even opening up not an exit survey, but while people are there, kind of having like check-ins with them to see how things are going. Also, one of the things that I feel like has helped me in the space where I am now, which is a lot more supportive than than some of the places that I've been in. But one of the things that is crucial to my success here is the fact that I feel like the ability to actually communicate when there's a problem. So like it's inevitable that we're going to have issues with anything that we deal with, whether we have our own businesses, whether we're working with people, you know, whether we're just working with products. Like there's always going to be an issue that presents itself. But how are we able to communicate that concern without it always seeming like there's something always wrong with fantasy, or you know, there's something always wrong with those people, like it's something with them, it's not something within our culture? Because I think that's a lot of it too. Some people have the mindset where it's like, if it's something going on with this person, it has to just be them. It's not like our culture. And that I think that kind of understanding like where people's mindsets and stuff are would also be a good start, because then you could actually tell like, okay, so this engineering manager or this product manager or this tech manager has this type of mindset, and then they get for instance, like a millennial comes in and is like, I'm not finna deal with this shit, like I'm just not, you know. And so I think that you're my superhero. I love cussing in professional spaces. That is me. my friends support me in all of my BS. But yeah, so I think that just also understanding the mindsets of the leaders that you have, right? Because that's going to determine a lot of how people feel comfortable within their particular space. Because I cannot like my coworker and not necessarily have to talk to them unless I have to do a particular thing with them. However, I have to interact with my supervisor, my manager, my partner every single day or every other day. So how are those interactions influencing people's like sense of belonging and like their ability to feel like they can create in that space? Because that's what you want, right? You want people who feel motivated to create, who feel motivated to produce, who feel motivated to collaborate with everybody. And I think it was Matt who was like, he said something about like, they're passionate, whether they're disagreeing with the product or the direction or not. I love that he said that, because it's not like progress or engagement is not always a positive thing, right? It could be positive that they're actually saying something negative about it, because then and you understand like how you can change it.
That's engineering culture. That's actually harder with groups outside of engineering, because by nature, right, they're problem solvers. So there's no problem to solve unless someone raises their hand and identifies the problem. So naturally, we as an organization, we're not afraid of the feedback. And so we are lucky. We have a really, really strong culture. People do not leave this organization because they don't like their manager. I am more concerned. We have had females leave because they are looking, for an environment where they can feel a little bit more connected. And we've got the double whammy of sports, right, and engineering, and we're trying to get better about that. But we've not ever had any feedback from someone to say, hey, I'm leaving because I don't feel like I fit in. And I don't know that 95% of most engineers are even going to realize that that might be a motivating factor. They don't have that self-awareness. And so and it's hard to collect data to know if that's for sure, but that is, we are going to operate on the assumption that is happening, that people are, they could be happier at work if they felt more inclusive, if we did a better job of making them feel more part of the team. And it shows itself in other ways, like in our engagement survey scores, right? There's not anything specifically pointing out to say like, hey, I feel less included because of my ethnicity. But if that group's scores are lower, there's something going on, right? And that means that they're not getting the same experience, or not, at least not perceiving things the same way. And that's the hard part. That's the challenge. Like, what can we do when maybe people who are affected by this aren't even aware that they're affected by it?
I think that's exactly what I was thinking about, John, when you were talking. Are the tools that will allow or empower our employees to drive their own sense of belonging, so that they can reflect on themselves and say, like, you know what, actually, I don't feel like I belong. I feel like I can't speak my mind. I don't feel safe in these meetings. This individual is making me X, Y, and Z. Are there any frameworks or tools or initiatives that you have seen that ultimately empower employees to drive their own sense of belonging and that piece of reflection? And maybe that's something for the next session. And I'm guessing the Women in Tech conversation tomorrow might lean into some of this.
Yeah, so I mean, there's certainly tools that we can provide, and like some of the parts of the handout that create frameworks for how to run spaces, that's really pivotal, because why people don't speak out is because of power, right? And so until we reduce the hierarchies and structures of power, people are less likely to speak to that. And so I certainly think that we can encourage and empower people to think about their experiences. I can say that I didn't realize all the ways that I experienced engineering as a woman until I joined the Women in Engineering group. by force of a mentor. She's like, you're going to go to this women in engineering event. I said, I don't need help. Like, I don't need to remind everyone I'm a woman. And she's like, first of all, when a senior vice president tells you to do something, you don't say no. And so I went, and I remember like it was a visceral experience sitting around this boardroom table, and all these women are like sharing their experiences. And I was like, oh my gosh, like, you mean this is not supposed to happen? Like, this is not what it's supposed to be like. And so having that space and really helping people like myself, it's ironic given that my whole career is on this now, but in 11 years of college, I never, ever went to like a women in engineering event. Not once.
I am so excited that you have this story, because I think it really speaks to the women in technology group that we are trying to ultimately kickstart and inject some life into. I think there are many women that ultimately feel like they don't, like, why would I go there? Like, yes, I'm a female engineer. There shouldn't be anything different about me. Almost trying to push in another direction to prove the point that there shouldn't be this differentiator based on your gender, but actually, hopefully there's plenty of strength that can be sourced through those conversations and networks and discussions, debates, and everything in between.
Maybe that's the selling point. Like, here's an opportunity. Don't assume. Go in, to learn. Don't assume you know what you don't know. You might learn something, and you might be surprised.
Yeah. Well, this is giving me some great ideas for the event tomorrow morning as well, and great ideas for our event next time. And so I'll connect with Laura after, and not tonight, because Kayla and Fantasy, they're in London, so it's way past their bedtime. Lila too.
Oh my goodness.
And so we'll connect later, and whatever feedback you get, we can use that to inform our next steps as well. Not before tomorrow morning though, but like,
thank you. Appreciate that. It's been absolutely amazing. And hi, Tim. So I've not had a chance to kind of spend any time with you recently. So hello. And Kieran, can I just check? Did you want to say something earlier?
No, I think I was just, I was only when John was speaking about it, I just felt, I think the intentions for large part, if I were to guess, is there. I think a lot of times we just need to make time for it and a way to think about it and do it. To me, that's been the struggle, because I think the intentions are generally here in a good place, but that's not enough, as you were calling out earlier today. I think that was what I was trying to emphasize, that we need to put into action. I think that's a tougher part.
Yeah.
So I didn't realize we have more people on the call in the UK than here in the States. So it's super late for you guys. Thank you for everybody for staying on.
Yeah, thank you.
I mean, I'll talk about this all day long, but I do have another meeting, so I do have to turn to that. But I'm so thrilled that you all stayed to chat with us. This was really valuable. So thanks for offering your expertise and your reflections, Tim and Kieran and Leela and John and Laura. I really appreciate that.
Lovely to meet you all.
Great. Look forward to next month.
Yeah.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much. Take
Bye.
care. Bye.
Yeah, bye.